evening, this is Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight we will be dealing with the question, who wants waste? In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, it's incredible how many billions of dollars of fraud and waste have been uncovered and exposed by President Donald Trump's DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency, and its war on waste. What is even more incredible is to see how many congressmen and journalists seemed to be more outraged by the expose than by the corruption, embezzlement and waste itself. Why are so many defending corruption and opposing the war on waste?
Well, one would assume that they're actually part of the corruption, because who would oppose war on waste? Who could defend corruption? And it's incredible. You couldn't make this stuff up. Monty Python couldn't have had a script like this. $2.5 million for testing the fertility of transgender mice, for goodness sakes. Sex changes in Guatemala, a gay Sesame Street film for Iraq, LGBTQ comics, and DEI concerts in Ireland. I mean, really, who comes out with idiotic ideas like this? I think of the scripture 2 Peter 2 verse 19. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. You could write that verse across most government departments. They promise liberty, but they are slaves of corruption. And yes, I would say the only people who want to defend corruption are those who are involved in it. And the ones who want to oppose the war on waste, well, it's because they're the ones who are benefiting from that waste, because they're obviously on the take. And I would imagine that what we're seeing now is people admitting to the fact that they are part of the corruption if they are wanting to defend corruption.
How big a problem is government corruption?
Well, just today's headlines, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, has uncovered a staggering $4.7 trillion, that's trillion with a T, $4.7 trillion in federal payments that are nearly impossible to trace due to the long-standing bureaucratic loophole, because this revelation from DOGE marks one of the most significant financial accountability failures in American history. And they found a financial black hole, the Treasury Access Symbol, or TAS, a crucial coding system meant to link federal payments to specific budgetary line items. However, the DOGE investigators found for many years the TAS field has been treated as optional, and so billions and even trillions of taxpayer dollars have flowed through the system without any clear documentation of where they're being allocated or why. Like, you've got an allocation, okay, so many million went to, Guatemala or Afghanistan. Now, we know in some cases, like the Afghanistan money was to provide irrigation for heroin, opium fields. You can't let them not get enough irrigation, for goodness sakes. And, funding millions of condoms for Gaza in Mozambique and things like that. And, tremendous wastage. But most of the fields at the Treasury departments, they made it impossible for auditors to know where the money's going or why. And so entire departments have failed to provide the TAS codes, leaving federal spending functionally untraceable. And buried deep in outdated financial protocols, this issue has gone unnoticed until Elon Musk has brought it to everyone's attention. So the situation is very bad. And the African Union calculates every year over 148 billion US dollars, not Zimbabwe dollars, US dollars, 148 billion is stolen from the continent of Africa by its own leaders. Now that, by the way, works out to more than 1/4 of the continent's entire gross domestic product, lost to corruption every single year. The World Bank reports 40% of Africa's private wealth is held offshore. Now, you would think Africa could keep its wealth in Africa, but apparently not. African leaders don't even believe in their own country or continent. Global Financial Integrity calculates Africa's lost well over $900 billion, very close to $1 trillion, and that's lost since 1970. That's a few years old stat, so it could easily be over $1 trillion already. That's far in excess of the total developmental assistance given to Africa during the same time. Some people are crying about losing American aid. Well, you can get a lot more benefit from cutting corruption than you can from getting foreign aid. Our corruption in Africa is more than 10 times all the foreign aid that we receive. So how about just cutting corruption? Instead of increasing taxes, how about the government just stealing less? Most states are effectively bankrupt. They're weighed down by debt. They're failing to provide even basic minimum public services. And minimum public services you'd think government should provide as water, electricity, roads, railways, postal service, health, security, justice. I mean, these are most important. And most governments in Africa are failing to provide those basic minimums.
An ANC president of South Africa once famously claimed that corruption doesn't hurt anyone, essentially claiming that it is a victimless crime.
Well, he's totally wrong. Corruption actually steals from everyone. Most African countries today have a lower per capita income than they had at so-called independence. So living in what they call freedom, but most of them are worse off now than they were when they were under so-called colonialism. More than half of Africa's total population live on less than $2 a day. That's $2 a day on average. Nahu Ribadu, the former head of Nigeria's Anti-Corruption Commission, declared the very best way to attack poverty is to attack corruption, because poverty steals from the resources needed for efficient and effective government, and corruption prevents a country from realizing its potential. Corruption steals from absolutely everyone. It's calculated that every one of us is paying at least 20% more for our goods and services because of the cost of corruption. And if you just think of the different things that are stolen, whether it's shoplifting for a shop or theft by government, we're all paying literally 20% more for every item, every single item, as a result of the corruption. So it's stolen from all of us. Just think of, would you like 20% more of all the money that you had last year? Well, that could easily be done if you could just eradicate corruption.
With so many leaders seeming to defend their right to have wasteful and fraudulent expenditures, what is the problem with corruption?
Well, corruption actually discourages investment, it retards development, increases costs to the consumer. So corruption makes a country poor. And Robert Guest, the African editor of The Economist, observed in his brilliant book, The Shackled Continent, which is excellent read, he quotes, for half a century now, the continent of Africa has been deluged with aid. But this aid has failed to make Africans any less poor. It has actually bankrolled tyrants or idealists with hopeless economic policies. Both types of aid have been wasted. Doing business in Africa can be tricky. Bad roads, punctuated by roadblocks manned by bribe-hungry policemen, make it slow and costly to move goods even short distances. A missionary to Congo spoke of 5 roadblocks in 1 kilometer, each one demanding bribes. I mean, how can you do any work in that situation? Even missionaries find it hard to do their work. Local firms have been held back by arbitrary government irregulations and regularities. Dysfunctional legal system. The difficulty for anyone without political connections of raising capital. If Africa was better governed, it would be richer. And that's true. So economist Robert Guest concluded, Africans are poor because they're not yet free. They live under predatory, incompetent governments which impoverish them in many ways, through corruption, through bad economic policies like socialism, and sometimes, as in Zimbabwe, by creating an atmosphere of terror. And that's true. We've been in Zimbabwe many times, and it is an atmosphere of absolute terror. People getting their arms broken for voting for the opposition. People getting murdered because they are friends of somebody who's in the other party, and so on. And so plainly what you're dealing with is corruption and predatory officials. That's the problem.
Is there any hope of ever dealing with or eradicating the pervasive culture of corruption in government?
Well, yes. I think President Donald Trump and Elon Musk's DOGE initiative, eliminating waste and fraud and abuse in government spending, is providing an inspiring example of how corruption can be exposed. It can be opposed. It can be eradicated by bold initiatives and decisive action. And many government departments are not only wasteful and inefficient and corrupt, many government departments are completely unnecessary. And I think that this has been proven by DOGE, I think every country needs a department of governmental efficiency. Elon Musk is showing the way. We really need some businessman, not a politician, to go through looking at things in a business-like way. Is this department even necessary? And they concluded even the Department of Education in America is completely unnecessary. It's a federal position. It didn't exist before 1970s. I think it came in about 1980. And so the Department of Education, as they discovered, hasn't educated a single soul, has not built a single classroom, has not done anything to educate anyone. And the more money they put into the Department of Education, the dumber the children of America get. And they pointed out that out of 40 leading countries in the world, America ranks dead last. They're number 40 out of 40. And they put more money per student in than any other country in the world, and they get the worst results. And so Department of Education, doesn't matter how many billions and trillions they get, they don't improve the education of anyone, because they're just a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in Washington, D.C. mostly. And that's why America is deciding to abolish the national or federal agency for Department of Education and put it back to the local states. Let Ohio run Ohio's education, let Arizona run Arizona's education, and they're convinced they're going to get better results. So there's entire departments that are not necessary. Do we really need a cabinet position of Ministry of Youth and Culture? And I mean, there's so many time-wasting, money-wasting, ridiculous interfering. Do you need a Ministry of Sport, for goodness sakes? Can it not be run by the local clubs and schools and provinces? Do you need a national department, Ministry of Sports? And so many others. Just to give you a joke, when I was in Zambia, they told me a joke about South Africa. The South African ambassador came along and they introduced him to the Zambian Minister of Naval Affairs. And the South African said, "You can't have a Ministry of Naval Affairs, you're a landlocked country." And the Zambian responded, "But in South Africa, don't you have a Ministry of Justice?" And all the Zambians are laughing because, I mean, to them, South Africa's Justice Department's a joke. So obviously, one person can make a difference. Under Nahu Rabadu, Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission secured 250 convictions, recovered over $1 billion in stolen public funds. So it can be done. The president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, is advocating trade, not aid. He says he doesn't want any foreign aid. He just wants fair trade. He's convinced it's essential for Africa to end dependency on foreign aid. And he's even on record saying it's good that America's cutting the U.S. Agency for International Development, because we need to be more self-sufficient. We shouldn't be dependent on foreign aid. Foreign aid fuels corruption. And I mean, that's true. We know it. Corruption is the second most prevalent crime on the continent. And leaders need to become more accountable to the taxpayers. And you need auditors. And it seems that nothing's been audited of USAID. They've been a corruption slush fund. So leaders need to become accountable to their own taxpayers, their own citizens. And anti-corruption reforms are essential. Leaders steal 7 times more than the total value of all the foreign aid poured into Africa every year. It's clearly far more valuable than any foreign aid would be to end the endemic corruption which is looting the resources of this great continent. Africa should be a very rich continent. Just think of the Congo, which is one of the most impoverished countries in Africa with a total failed state. And yet, at one stage, their president, Mobutu Sese Seko, was interviewed by a journalist who courageously said, "Sir, how is it possible that Zaire is the 4th poorest country in the world, but you're the 5th richest man in the world?" And he responded, "I'm not the 5th richest, I'm the 4th richest person in the world." In fact, his personal worth was about equal to the national debt of the country of Zaire, which Congo was then called. And this is the problem. We've got massive amounts of corruption. And when most of the wealth of Africa is being held offshore, the looters in chief, the kleptomaniacs who run these countries, have been filling their Swiss bank accounts and so on. And their people are literally starving. And there's no medicines in the hospitals. And the people are in schools with roofs missing, desks gone, 70, 80 kids per classroom. No textbooks have arrived for the whole year. And yet the government can spend millions on vodka, millions on caviar. I mean, most trivial garbage on their celebrations, and pour in millions on celebrating the anniversary of the revolution and things like this. And meanwhile, their people don't have running water. They don't have basic plumbing, don't have basic medical treatments and so on. And there's no doubt what Africa needs is trade, not aid.
And what is the situation in South Africa, Dr. Hammond?
Well, the government is stealing from the poor. So since its inception, SARS, the South African Revenue Service, has collected, according to their own website, 21 trillion rand in net tax revenues. 21 trillion tax collections represents a growth of 9.9% per year, let's say 10% per year, since the inception of SARS in 1997. So every year they're collecting about 10% more taxes than the year before, which is phenomenal growth of the taxes. Measured against the budget estimate of 1,547.1 billion, this results in a surplus of 16 billion. 16 billion surplus. So in other words, our government in South Africa, according to their own website, is taxing people more than they need to, because there's a surplus of 16 billion from the taxes over against the budget. And the main source of revenue is personal income tax. That accounts for 1,563 billion. That's personal income tax, or PIT. And I think most of the money goes into the PIT. And so personal income tax is collecting over 555 billion. That is 35% of the government revenue comes from personal income tax, which only a very small minority of the country pays. Then you get value-added tax, which we all have to pay on every single product, including Bibles, electricity, water. You pay value-added tax on everything, even services. Even when you go to the dentist or the doctor, you're paying value-added tax on everything, absolutely everything. Then there's company income tax. Now, value-added tax is another 390 billion, 25%. Company income tax contributes another 323 billion, 20%. Then there's custom duties, which is only 3.7% or 58 billion. Oh, I mean, that's still a lot of money, but still. And that means the government's taking a huge amount of money from us. But according to the Transparency International, the Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI, South Africa scored 41. Now, basically you get 100 for highly corrupt, you get 0 for no corruption. So it's a Transparency International. And now Denmark is the least corrupt country in the world. They get 90 points. South Sudan's the most corrupt with 8 points. And so in South Africa, we get 42 points. So we are below the global average of 43. We are making a decline since 2019 in particular. So our country is getting less transparent, more corrupt. Even though people had this perception that the corruption was a Zuma problem and under Ramaphosa we haven't had corruption. Well, not according to Transparency International. And so the data sources used to compile this cover is bribery, diversion of public funds, and officials using public office for private gain, government's ability to contain public sector corruption, excessive red tape, which always increases corruption opportunities, nepotistic civil service appointments, and state capture by narrow vested interests. These are the things they consider, and we end up with a rating of 41, which makes us 82nd out of 180 countries in terms of transparency or not being corrupt. So we roughly smack in the middle of the corruption index. And this doesn't include illicit financial flows or money laundering or private sector corruption. This is just government corruption. And every week our newspapers are full of scandals about elected officials and public servants, extravagant lifestyles, outrageous expenditures. But despite the ANC ranking they reckon more than 600 billion a year just in personal income tax every year. They consistently are running at a deficit, even though they've got a surplus of taxes versus what's on our budget. And taxpayers wonder, where is all this money going? We have so many schools in South Africa without books, so many children taught in the open air because their buildings haven't been built yet or there's no roof and the buildings are in shocking conditions. We heard from Department of Education, 85% of our schools are dysfunctional. Hospitals are short of medicines. Patients are going hungry in hospitals because the provincial government hasn't paid the service providers. And then the Auditor General of South Africa reported billions in unauthorized spending for the fiscal year. How is it possible that you can spend billions in unauthorized spending? You shouldn't be able to spend R1 in unauthorized spending, you would think. Only 3 of the 39 government departments had actual audits. The Police Special Investigating Unit reported at least 30 billion rand was lost to government corruption just last year. And that's much less than what the African Union estimates. So the finances of 5 provinces in South Africa are in severe disarray. And heading the list of spending way beyond their means is Limpopo province, which is basically dominated by the EFF, which is meant to be the Economic Freedom Fighters, but I think it stands for Everything for Free Party. And even with 2 billion being overspent, the Limpopo government couldn't pay doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, other public sector employees, and it couldn't deliver any school books in the calendar year. No schools got any school books in Limpopo. But considering the quality of those textbooks, maybe that's not so bad. And then it's not just in the government. There's Cricket SA. The former president of Cricket SA was engulfed in corruption crisis. The arms deal of 1999 continues to make headlines, along with the Travelgate abuse of public finances by members of parliament, and the National Police Commissioner and President of Interpol convicted on corruption charges, Chief of Police suspended for corruption investigations, Traffic Police under investigation for buying and selling illegal licenses. The examples of unscrupulous politicians squandering public money with impunity, stealing from the poor in the name of uplifting the poor is endemic. So officially, last year, there were over 1,300 corruption convictions, including 500 government officials. That's the ones who got convicted. 14 billion rand in assets frozen in corruption state capture cases. 34 cases involving more than 200 accused persons, including former cabinet ministers, some of the largest corporations in the country like McKinsey and ABB. Despite being above the average sub-Saharan African country's economy, South Africa still has high corruption in its public sector. And this includes maladministration, procurement corruption, abuse of authority. And South Africa is subject to a whole lot of corruptions. They list officially as wasteful expenditure, such as they get a BBBE quote, they get the job, but they don't, they overestimate because they know being BBBEE, they're going to get preference in being chosen. So in many cases, say they bid to build a soccer stadium for R1 billion. And meanwhile, there's some white company that said, we can build the stadium with 800 million. So next thing, the BBBEE company gets the bid because they're BBBEE, and so broad-based black economic empowerment. Then they go to the white competition company that said they could do it for 800 million. Can you do it for 800 million? Yes, we can. Good, we'll pay you to do it. So they pocket 200 million for themselves, but they don't even do the work. So some of these companies, even shell companies, because they outsource the work to another company that didn't make the BBBEE requirement, but they're able to then make more profit. And this means the public pays more for what should have cost them a lot less, which leaves less money for other projects. So there's lots of corruption connected to broad-based black economic empowerment legislation and state capture scandals of some of our politicians, even the President Zuma, the Gupta family from India, brought all this kind of corruption into public spotlight. But there's much more petty corruption. And everyday public services, day-to-day life in South Africa, the local municipalities have been significantly impacted by corruption. In fact, Corruption Watch describes the municipalities as the most corrupt institutions in the country. And if you see what the town councillors get, they get a huge amount of salary. I mean, it's a get-rich-quick scheme. Where city councillors used to be honorary position, they got no salary, and they were successful businessmen who donated their time. But now, a 2022 report by Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime has described the presence of organized crime, especially in municipalities, as an existential threat to South Africa's democratic institutions, its economy, and its people. If the provinces were commercial enterprises, our provinces would have been declared insolvent and liquidated to settle their debts. All too many politicians view government positions as an opportunity to enrich themselves at the public expense. So we've got a toxic mixture of politics, business, greed, sabotaging development, costing jobs, eroding the economy. You often get a politician who's got a company who then gets the bids, or it's his brother-in-law's company or something, but it's a real lot of kickback and wasted money all over the place.
This is all very serious and concerning, but is corruption only an issue in the political and business world, or is there also corruption in churches and missions?
Sadly, no, this is not only a problem for the world. Patrick Johnson, our good friend and author of Operation World, he reports in The Future of the Global Church that of the $390 billion US dollars given to Christian causes worldwide, 25 billion is embezzled. He calculated up to 20% of the global gross domestic product is spent on bribery, and over $1 trillion a year that works out to. Up to 50% of all aid to developing countries is stolen before it can reach its intended recipients, and worldwide they estimate that 400 billion US dollars is lost to corruption. Every year, 10% of humankind is forced to pay a bribe. And I'm sorry to say that even happens in missions where we cannot move sometimes in some countries like the Congo without paying some kind of bribe, even though our mission's got a policy of never paying a bribe. But what we've got to do is come up with creative alternatives, which I call incentives. So before we cross the border into Mozambique or Congo, we'll go to the bakery, buy a lot of bread, loaves of bread, and then give loaves of bread at traffic lights, at roadblocks, which isn't worth a lot of money, but it means a lot to those people. They can't get a fresh baked loaf of bread and things like that. And sometimes we've had to buy a whole lot of digital watches back when they were not very expensive. I remember buying lots of digital watches at R2 each at Game, but that's back in South Africa, 1980s, when a rand was worth a lot more, and giving them where we were demanded to pay a bribe. We'd have these digital watches on our arm, literally take it off our arm and hand one of these watches to these chaps. Not very expensive, but it was perceived high value, and many of them were so excited to have a wristwatch, they would wave us on. So we'd have to find creative alternatives to a bribe. It's our principle not to hand money over, but we do often give food, and sometimes other things like a calculator. I remember that was very popular in Eastern Europe at the time, that we'd have calculators we could give to police at roadblocks and at these border posts, because that was what they were after. In fact, I know some missionaries to Eastern Europe who would literally get cartons of cigarettes, because a pack of cigarettes could get them through almost any roadblock or any bribe situation, that the police or army were just thrilled to that. So while the missionaries I'm thinking of would never smoke a cigarette, they did use some as a bribe item, perceived bribe item. I've been happier to hand out tins of food or loaves of bread. But yeah, there's a lot of corruption. I think we need a DOME, Department of Mission Efficiency, and we need a DOSE, or Department of Church Efficiency, because there is corruption. And I've come across financial officers who steal, accountants and bookkeepers in some missions who steal. We've come across the head of security of one major church in Cape Town, who was a front page expose that he was stealing the church donations, Sunday morning offerings, and the pastor was berating the congregation for not tithing, and meanwhile his own security man his right-hand man was stealing from the congregation's tithes. So make no mistake, yes, corruption is a reality in churches and missions too, very sadly.
But corruption goes even deeper than all this, doesn't it? What is the role of banks in corruption?
Probably the greatest corruption and theft in history is perpetrated by bankers. Now often we call them banksters, merging the word banker and gangster. And so the banksters who triggered the Great Recession of 2008, maybe you've seen the documentary Inside Job, through unethical speculation and selling of worthless derivatives, which was basically bundled up debts that others had, unpayable debts. The cost to the American economy of the 2008 financial collapse was over 135% of its GDP. I mean, that's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And the cost to the United Kingdom of Great Britain was over 149% of its total GDP, trillions of pounds. The only people who benefited from the depression caused by this totally irresponsible speculative bubble of 2008 was the banksters themselves, because you might have noticed that it was the economic recession of 2008, the so-called October surprise, any government or party that's in power in America that has an economic collapse just a month before the election is going to lose. And so the Republicans looked pretty strong under George W. Bush Jr. In 2008. Barack Hussein Obama of the Democrats came to power as a direct result of this worthless derivatives bubble bursting in 2008. And interestingly, he came to power as a result of the collapse, and then he rewarded all the banksters. He took taxpayer money to pay off the bank's debts that they were in, and you could get the CEO of these companies walking away with billions and sometimes up to $1 trillion in personal wealth, while they'd looted their company and their company had collapsed. The shareholders were impoverished. Workers lost their jobs. Millions of people lost their jobs all over the world. Millions of people lost their homes. Millions of people lost their savings as a result of the unethical bankers selling worthless derivatives. Derivatives are basically debts accumulated from other people. You know, they give housing loans and high purchase loans for cars to people who obviously can't pay and who won't pay, and who, you know, drug addicts and illegal immigrants and things like this. And at the end, they bought up all these worthless debts and sold it to people who thought that it was worth something. And these people were left holding basically an empty paper bag. And so this was a case of where you had privatized profits, but you had nationalized debt. So the national debts of all of the debts of the banks were settled by taxpayers. And the corrupt criminals who'd engineered this, the bankers or banksters, walked away with private wealth that's just unimaginable. So that's just one example. And this reminds us of Proverbs 11, verse 1. The Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight. Now, just to give you an idea of how corrupt inflation is, you know, if you or I print rands on our photocopier, that's counterfeiting. But if the government prints money, it's called inflation. And so the government has sometimes printed vastly more money than there's gold or value to back it. So just a survey of inflation in South Africa, undertaken by the Old Mutual. In 1971, you could buy a car for 1,000 rand. In fact, I remember my father bought a new car for 1,000 rand in 1971. In 1981, the same amount of money, 1,000 rand, could buy a motorbike. And I actually bought my first vehicle, a motorbike, in 1981. It cost about 1,000 rand. So Old Mutual is accurate. In 2001, the buying power of 1,000 rand collapsed, so you could buy a bicycle. And I remember buying a bicycle for about 1,000 rand in 2001. Well, now the buying power of 1,000 rand has collapsed. You can't even buy a pair of running shoes for 1,000 rand. It's now about 3,000 or 4,000 rand to buy a pair of running shoes. So in just 40 odd years, 50 years, we've seen a move of where 1,000 rand could buy you a car, to a motorbike, to a bicycle, to now it can't even buy you a pair of running shoes. So that's what Amos 8 verse 5 says: skimping the measure, boosting the price, treating with dishonest scales, I will never forgive. To use Stephen Mitford Goodson's example, he says prices don't increase. He said money gets debased and devalued. So his example is, in the time of Julius Caesar, 2,000 years ago, you could buy a Roman toga for 1 gold coin. A Roman toga with a leather belt, leather shoes, cost you about 1 gold coin. Today, a suit with leather shoes and belt is going to cost you about 1 gold coin. So the price has not increased, it's that the money's been devalued. At one point, a pound in Britain meant a pound of silver. And there was a time that you had written on your 1 rand note, I promised to pay the bearer on demand 1 rand in gold. Well, I mean, 1 rand would be worth barely a grain of gold, forget about an ounce. And there was a time that the South African rand was one of the strongest currencies in the world. I remember growing up when 1 rand was much stronger than a British pound, stronger than German D-mark, stronger than American dollar. In fact, it took 3 American dollars to buy 1 Rhodesian dollar. The Rhodesian dollar was strong. South African rand was strong. And I remember traveling overseas back in the 1980s when the South African rand was stronger than the US dollar. So obviously something radically wrong has gone on that now a South African rand is worth, you need 20 South African rand to buy a dollar, about 24 rand to buy a British pound. So this is absolutely bizarre. And Amos 8 says, skimping the measure, boosting the price, treating with dishonest scales, I will never forgive. Micah 6, shall I count pure those with wicked balances? Those are the bank of deceitful weights. Her rich men are full of violence. Her inhabitants have spoken lies. Their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. And to quote again from Stephen Mitford Goodson, the American Reserve Bank is not American. It has no reserves, and it's not a bank. And the South African Reserve Bank is not South African. It has no reserves, and it's not a bank. So it's a total sham. So, for example, again, quoting from Stephen Mitford Goodson, who was once director of the South African Reserve Bank, and he's a whistleblower. He wrote the book Inside the South African Reserve Bank. And he said state capture actually began with Jan Smuts on behalf of the globalists setting up the South African Reserve Bank, which is a complete sham. So if you want to, let's say the government wants to borrow R1 billion. We'd like to borrow R1 billion. No problem. South African Reserve Bank creates R1 billion from a blip on a computer screen and just prints R1 billion of notes. There's nothing to back it. It didn't exist before the loan. The loan is actually fraudulent. But the interest charged on the taxpayer each year is very real. And so these bankers make a fortune. They make a killing, literally, out of getting governments to make big loans from them, which honestly any government could print their own money, which has been done, where you don't need to have interest on the loan. A government could create promissory notes that population could use without requiring that you've got to pay your debts to some banker who's enriching himself at your expense. And just think of the fact that they calculate now that you're working for the first 4 months of the year just to pay your taxes. So, in fact, in some countries it's more like 5 months, some countries in Europe even more. And so the government is stealing a huge amount of your work. When they didn't have usury or interest charged, Europe built the great cathedrals because people were only working about 140 days of the year, and they had over 220 days of the year as holidays, effectively. And so Europe, when they banned usury, were able to create phenomenal architectural masterpieces, these cathedrals, because they didn't have to pay interest to some bankers. And that, I think, explains a lot of the wars. And so Stephen Mitford Goodson's book, Central Banking and Enslavement of Mankind, to expose how that works.
What is the cost of crime, Dr. Hammond?
Well, it's estimated that approximately a third of all business failures every year can be traced to employee theft. Now, when a business closes down, employees lose their jobs and their families suffer. And it's estimated that almost half of all employees are guilty of stealing, which is often called shrinkage. So you go to a place like Pick and Pay and you want to know what's going on there and why their books don't balance. They'll say shrinkage, meaning their own employees are stealing. And obviously somebody has to pay for the cost of all this theft. And you and I and all other customers have to share the burden of the billions of rands shoplifted or stolen by employees, called shrinkage, or embezzled by civil servants. In addition, you have to pay for the increased insurance premiums, the additional security personnel, the equipment like closed-circuit TV cameras and so on. That's all necessitated by the spending spree, or in this case, stealing spree. It all gets added to the price tag of everything we pay. And we also pay for the cost of crime through our taxes and through supporting the police force, the legal judicial system, the prison service, all of which is meant to protect us from the criminal elements of society. To take a quote from Kenya, in Nairobi, often called Nairobi, they say 1/3 of Kenyans work. And they employ the other third of Kenyans as security guards to protect them from the other third of Kenya that steals. And so, it all makes work, I suppose, but that's some of the cost of crime. Just imagine how much money we are wasting because you also have to build high security fences and walls and wrought iron gates and so on around your properties. And every shop needs something like that. And now they need video cameras. They need some security people walking around catching shoplifters. And all of this gets added to the price of everything you're paying. Increased crime, And even the ones who get caught, they go to prison, and you've got to pay for their TVs, their food, their accommodation, everything else. And the cost of each prisoner in our prison system is about 100 and something thousand rand per prisoner per year. That's the cost of the security systems and everything they build there. So basically, we are being forced to pay for crime on every level. Just consider this. You have to buy an item. You pay 15% VAT on the item. Let's say you bought a audio-visual system. Now, you pay tax on your insurance. Then the item gets stolen. Now you've got to pay tax on the payout from the insurance company. And then you've got to pay tax on the buying up the replacement for this item. So the government actually is getting more money out of every crime than even the criminals are getting. So no wonder they encourage crime. It's one big, massive racket. We are being stolen from through corruption, through taxes, through embezzlement, by the banks, by inflation, and we're being stolen from by all the extra security we've got to do in order to protect ourselves from the criminal elements.
And why do we see crime and corruption increasing?
There's a verse in the Bible, Ecclesiastes 8 verse 11 says, "Why do people commit crime so readily?" And it answers it, because crime is not punished quickly enough. And surely that's the common sense answer. Corruption is increasing in our society because criminals are not punished swiftly enough. Justice must be done, it must be seen to be done, it must be done promptly. And God has instituted civil government as an agent of wrath to bring punishment on a wrongdoer. That's in Romans 13 verse 4. Civil government is called to be a minister or a deacon of God's justice, to punish those who do wrong. 1 Peter 2:14. So plainly, our government's first job is to punish the wicked in order to keep the law-abiding safe.
What then is the biblical solution to corruption, Dr. Hammond?
In a word, restitution. In cases of theft or arson or malicious damage to property, the Bible decrees restitution, the restoration of what was stolen to the owner. And it is reparation for injury or for damage to property or for arson. The Bible requires that restitution goes entirely to the victim of the crime. And in some cases, it might be twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5, even 7 times the cost. So, for example, if somebody steals your bicycle, now you don't have the bicycle. If you don't get the bicycle back for another year or so, you've got all this extra transportation cost, bus, train, whatever. And if you've got a cow and they steal a cow and you don't get it back immediately, you've got these months without the milk and other benefits you'd get from the cow. That's why sometimes restitution's got to be double, up to 7 times the value of the item stolen, depending on the circumstances and how long it is until restitution is done. So restitution is the biblical requirement. And as Christians, we call to the highest standards of integrity. We're not to fuel the corruption industry. We mustn't give in to pressure to pay bribes or award contracts on the basis of political connections or race and things like that. Crime can be combated and corruption can be eradicated if those who claim to be Christians will live according to biblical principles. So, example, a friend of mine in Zambia, Lawrence Tempwe, he worked in a bank, a standard bank, and over the years he embezzled money from it. When he is caught, he is sentenced to prison. And there, Lawrence was converted to Christ, reading From Prison to Praise, and after serving his prison sentence, he worked to repay the bank all that he had stolen from it. Now, according to the laws of Zambia, he had done the crime, he had paid the time. No one was expecting anything more from him. They had no requirement for restitution in Zambia's laws. But Lawrence knew from Scripture he was responsible to make full restitution. And can you imagine what a testament was when he repaid the bank? And Lawrence Tempwe went on to become head of prison fellowship in Zambia. And we could give other examples, like a good friend of ours, George Ush, who was in a very trusted position in diamond mines of Southwest Africa. And he stole a lot of diamonds successfully, was never caught. But when he was converted to Christ, he owned up, he confessed, he went before them, he repaid everything he had stolen. And that meant he lost his farm, he lost his home, he lost his business, ultimately lost his wife, who wasn't happy to live in the impoverished condition that his restitution had done. Even his daughter left when he threw out the TV set and said, we can't afford to have this either. But restitution, I know people who've done it, and it often costs a lot, but that is the biblical requirement. You can't just put people into prison where the victims have to now pay for his maintenance. The Bible requires restitution. Imagine how America could solve its national debt if they got these people who've been stealing all this money from them to pay back. The national treasury would be overflowing, especially if you institute the requiring to give multiple amounts because of aggravating circumstances, the length of time taken to do the restitution. And so the scripture says in Ephesians 5:11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We as Christians are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, to do to others as we want to be done unto. So we need to live the biblical principles of honesty and integrity and courage, speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves, being brave and bold for God. We will not lie, we will not steal, we will not cheat. Neither will we tolerate amongst ourselves anyone who does. I think that's the principle that will be a solution to our corruption culture.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. Are there any resources or any books that you mentioned that you'd like to repeat for the audience before we say goodbye?
Yes, I say Stephen Mitford Goodson's books, Inside the Southern Reserve Bank, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind. Those are super good. A secular book, but a very effective one, is The Shackled Continent by Robert Guest. The Shackled Continent, Africa's Past, Present and Future. That's helpful. I've written, of course, Biblical Principles for Africa, which covers a lot of these economic principles as well. And I'd recommend you contact Christian Liberty Books. Visit either www.christianlibertybooks.co.za or email admin@christianlibertybooks.co.za. There's some great biblical economics and anti-corruption materials available from there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hammond. In closing, I'd like to read from Psalm 94, verse 16. Who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.